Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer. Fertility expert Dr. Amy Arrach.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. As you guys know, I daydream baby making. I have a molecular geneticist that specializes in embryo testing. He daydreams embryo testing. So I asked him to come on today, and I'd like to introduce you guys to Dr. Nabil Arrach. Hi, Nabil.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. We're so excited to have you on today to talk about to test or not to test. That is the question. And of course, we're talking about embryo testing. And you founded Progenesis. So tell us about yourself, tell us about your company and what you do.
Thank you so much for inviting me to your show. My name is Nabil Arrach. I am the founder of Progenesis. We specialize in PGT-A and PGT-M testing, embryo testing. The company was founded in 2015. I was a researcher behind the test. 2013 and 14, I developed the first test that used next generation sequencing. It was the first kind of test that used the latest technology, and then that was my first step towards starting Progenesis in 2015.
That's really exciting. So you're on the forefront and you're the person that we want answering our questions today. Okay, are you ready for this question?
Absolutely.
So I do some weird stuff. I go into elevators and I like to ask people questions. And I just walked into an elevator with you. We walked in from the lobby level, and you have, from when we got into the elevator to get to the top of the building, to explain to me, what is PGT? Go.
PGT stands for pre-implantation genetic testing. Basically is a way of assessing embryo chromosomes to select the best embryo for implantation. Embryos that have extra chromosomes or missing chromosomes don't implant, and if they do, they miscarry, and if they don't miscarry, they will lead to a syndrome. Another way of testing embryos is pre-implantation genetic testing for monogenic diseases, or let's say monogenic diseases. In this case, what we do is we test the parents to look at what mutation they have, and we look for that particular mutation on embryos to reduce the risk of having an inherited condition that can be a cystic fibrosis or alpha thalassemia, or any other syndrome, any other genetic conditions that will may impact the quality of life of a child.
Ding! Okay, so now we landed at our floor. That was a great answer. So now we got off the floor. See, I told you I do some weird stuff. And we walk out, and there's 30,000 people, all fertility patients, who really want to know, what truly is it? What's the technology? Do you think everyone should test? Who should test and why? So just share with our audience some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's really an interesting question, because, if the patient is 40 years old or younger, and they have, 3, 4, 5 embryos, I would definitely say test, because when you test, you're choosing the best embryos as far as chromosome composition. So you're reducing miscarriage, and you are increasing the likelihood of implantation. So instead of trying 3 or 4 transfers, if you pick randomly an embryo, there is a chance that it could be 50 or 60%, depend on age, or 80% if the patient is 42, likelihood of being abnormal. So instead, you choose the one that is more likely to be normal. And by doing that, you are reducing the risk of miscarriage, saving time. So time to pregnancy is shorter, and you're saving costs and saving emotional damages that one would be exposed to if they have to go through a lot of miscarriages. if the patient is 43 or 44 and have only one embryo to transfer, and I know they have only 15 or 10% chance of having a normal embryo, that's a difficult decision. I think from my perspective, I will give them the best information I have on hand. We have tested over 50,000 embryos, so we know what the statistics are, and give them genetic counseling option. And the patient will make that decision. You know, some patients wanted to try their luck, so you can't tell them don't transfer. You have to really just inform them, give them enough information, and they'll let them make the decision.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so now pretend I'm in the 4th grade or 5th grade. I don't know anything about chromosomes. I don't know anything about genes. And you've now just completely confused me because you're talking about all this alphabet soup. Can you just break down the difference between chromosomes and genes?
Yeah, so look at chromosome as the word structure, buildings, in which you have genes. The genes are inside a physical structure, which is a chromosome. So a normal male, a person has 22 pair of autosomal chromosomes, 1 to 22, and then they have X and Y because it's a male. For a female, 22 pair of chromosome, and then X and X. The genes are just pieces that lies within the chromosome that have a function. That function could be a biological function, or it could be a protein or enzyme. It's a piece of the chromosomes. Not all DNA within a chromosome encode for a function. There is only 20,000 genes within the entire genome. 20,000. The rest we used to call it garbage DNA. Now we know that it has a lot of functions and regulatory aspects and others. And so that's the difference between a chromosome. Chromosome is the structure. The gene is what is inside a chromosome.
And then why can't we test for, I mean, you just mentioned 20,000. I mean, that doesn't seem like a lot. Like, why can't we test for things like ADD, ADHD, autism, schizophrenia? Because I can tell you that for my patients, they think that when they're doing genetic testing of their embryos, they're also screening for these diseases, which my patients, after they see me, they know that that's the case. But why can't we?
That's a great question. The first quick answer to that is, let's look at how many embryos a common patient will have. If that patient has only 2 or 3 embryos, you're hoping to at least have one to transfer that is chromosomally balanced. If you add more selection to that patient, they're not gonna have a transfer. If you find, and I can tell you from looking at a lot of genetic reports, everybody has mutations. And those mutations, you don't know if sometimes they are called, non-significant, insignificance, have insignificant impact or unknown impact. So I think the first answer would be, the more you test, the less likely you have a transfer. That's number one. Number two, if you look at diseases like neurological diseases such as autism or schizophrenia, it's usually a lot of genes. For example, in the case of autism, we have more than 100 genes at least that interplay that causes the disorder. And it's not always one gene, one effect. It's multiple genes. It's a very complex relationship there. So what that means is, it's not easy to just test those genes and then find out whether that person may or may not may or may not be autistic. You have to just use risk assessments. We have been looking for genes for autism for many months. And there are databases that will tell you, okay, gene X and Y and Z have been linked to autism, but there is no study that really look at all these genes in combination. And so there is a challenge as far as what we know. But as far as testing, it's not a challenging thing to test. Testing is pretty easy to design and perform. What is difficult is to know whether that information has a clinical value or not. And that's where we're learning.
So are you telling me that one day we actually might get there, that we would be able to test for these genes in the embryos and give patients this type of information to help make decisions about which embryo to transfer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no doubt about it. As of now, if we wanted to test for a large number of genetic conditions, we can do it on embryos. We've tested embryos on a full exome, meaning all the genes, and I think we can sample about 30%. So 30% now with the technology is getting close to 50%. That means you can look at technically 10,000 genes in one embryo. So from a technology perspective, it's not very difficult to do. It's just whether you have the right information and the studies to make your your call accurate enough for a transfer.
Got it. Okay, so you've broken down some big words for us: chromosomes, genes, and then one word that's very important for me to make sure my patients know is mosaicism. And I think it's really important for every patient out there listening to this to know their clinic's policy for reporting on mosaic embryos and transferring mosaic embryos. So, doctor, what is mosaicism?
Thank you so much. Mosaicism is like when you're talking about a mosaic paint. So you have different colors. It's the same concept. So a mosaic embryo is an embryo that has a mix of cells. Some cells are normal with normal karyotype, and some cells are abnormal, have an extra chromosome. How does it happen, right? So when the egg is fertilized with the sperm, the cells start dividing. And so in that cell division, chromosomes will duplicate within one cell, and then they will segregate, right? They will separate so that two cells will have the same number of chromosomes. That exercise does not always happen accurately. So sometimes you have an extra chromosome that goes to one cell, and the other cell has a missing chromosome. And those two cells, if they start dividing, then you're going to start having a mix of cells that are normal and abnormal. That's the mosaicism, how you define it. The question is it real? Does it happen in nature, right? We have seen a lot of individual with mosaicism. For example, trisomy 21, 5% of kids that have trisomy 21 are mosaic. And we have seen miscarriages, mosaicism in miscarriages. There is a study that I looked at not too long ago with 1,000 patients looking at miscarriage and CVS data. And the estimates rate of mosaicism in that study was about 3.5%. If you look at other studies, is about 3%. When we look at our data, PGT-A data on embryos, we see about 2.5%. So differences between laboratories. So some laboratories will report 10%, 15%, 20%. And so you ask yourself, how come that you're seeing such a difference between two laboratories? The answer to that is it depends on what technology platform they are using and how they're handling that data. Because the way I see mosaicism is, if you have an embryo at day one with two cells, and one of them had we call it non-disjunction event, basically an error in separation of chromosomes, then the mosaicism rate is 50%. If it happens in day three, in day two, that's 1 out of 4, that's 25%. The application that labs are using currently don't detect anything below 20%. So what that means is any error that happens in cell division, if it happens after day 3, is not detectable anyway. And so we detect only the one that happens very early, at very early stage. And so that's in combination with the fact that miscarriages are only 3%, 35% mosaicism rates. I think mosaicism rate reported by certain labs is just inflated. And I have to add to that one more fact. There is no genetic markers that tells you this embryo is mosaic. It's just an algorithm that labs use to estimate the number of sequences, and based on that, it will tell you, oh, it is not a 3-copy, it's not a 1-copy. 3-copy chromosome is trisomy, 1 copy is monosomy. It's somewhere between 2 and 3, but that's just a calculation of numbers. Does not really translate in a biological mosaicism. So to summarize all that, I think mosaicism is inflated in certain labs. I think it should be somewhere between 2 to 3%. I think most of the time we don't see it because people that have mosaicism, 2% or 3%, we will never see it. And probably they will be born and you will never know about it. So that's my opinion about mosaicism. If you have an embryo that is mosaic, you need to have a discussion with the lab, with a genetic counselor, and with your physician, and then come up with a decision. The mosaic calls that we don't recommend transferring are the syndromic one, chromosome 13, 18, 21. Why? Because they are more likely, if they are real, they are more likely to stay, and then the likelihood of having a syndrome is higher. Other than that, we know that monosomies, the ones that are missing a chromosome, are less likely to stay to implants. And so if you have a monosomy, you have more chance to transfer that. The trisomy have more chance of implanting. So when you look at miscarriages in general, about 65% of all these embryos that in a normal conception without looking at IVF, those trisomies, 65% are single trisomies. Mm-hmm. So that's how I see the decision of transferring an embryo.
I find this extremely helpful, and I'm glad that you're sharing this with us. And what is your genetic company's policy on reporting mosaicism? Because I know a lot of doctors tell the genetic testing company that they use, I don't want to know about it, don't tell me about it. So do you automatically tell all your clients and patients about it, or do you let the doctors opt in to disclosing this information?
The physician has the say whether they wanted to see mosaicism results or not. If they say, okay, I don't want to see mosaicism result in the reports, then we will report that as abnormal. Again, our rate is 2.5%. It's like in 100, you're going to find 2 cases. If the report has mosaic, if it's a low mosaicism level, then automatic, and the patient does not have any other chance of transferring. If they have the only embryo they have is mosaic, automatically we enroll them in genetic counseling session, and we want them to go through that exercise of knowing all the risks associated. And then between the patient, genetic counselor, and the physician, there is a decision made there.
Yeah. So ASRM just came out with, I don't remember if it was a committee opinion or practice, like some sort of policy. I should have it top of mind. Basically saying that all patients should be told if their physician is not going to report mosaicism to them. They should be told up front. And so that's why I do the show and I talk about these kinds of things, because people just don't know that they need to ask up front before they even do IVF, because I'm passionate about this because I've had many beautiful mosaic babies born. My patient population is older. The average patient that I have is between 39 to 41. And I take every single embryo seriously and the information that I'm given seriously. And I know these babies are now toddlers, and I know they're doing great. And I don't have the worries about their outcomes, because their chromosomes are actually normal. Like they did CVS, they did amnio, they did karyotypes. So that's kind of why I get fired up about talking about this stuff. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so now, people can go online and they Google this stuff. I mean, I tell patients I'm a lot faster than your Google search. So if you ever have a question about the technology and what it is, like ask me. But people go online, they find this stuff about how abnormal embryos can turn into healthy babies. And my theory on that is that the likelihood of that happening is so low, it's close to 0. And if someone is transferring an abnormal embryo that turns into a healthy baby, it was most likely mosaic. What is your opinion on that?
We know that there are certain physicians in discussion with the patient, sometimes they decide to transfer an embryo because that's the only embryo they have. We have not seen, in our hand, we have not seen an embryo that have implanted that is abnormal. But I can definitely understand why certain, patients will want it to transfer, because they say, well, maybe in case, it's not a fully abnormal embryo. And I think that's where the relationship with the laboratory has to be really open. Once we have a result and someone asks about that result, we share with them the actual plots, the raw data, and we try to run them through that process. We have scored, over 50,000 embryos, so we have lots of experience scoring embryos. But what I can say about PGT-A testing is, if an embryo is clearly abnormal, it's very, very unlikely that embryo will implant. But if it's mosaic, definitely is an option.
Right. And how do you know your testing is accurate? I mean, how do you know that? I mean, I know the answer to this, but I'd love for you to share that with us. How do you know that an abnormal embryo is really abnormal without transferring it?
Yeah. So first of all, abnormal and normal is a relative thing, right? So it's a euploid, aneuploid. It has 23 pair of chromosome, each one that is reported as normal. Now we have started to change it to euploid, aneuploid, because really normal, there is no such a normal thing, right? So, and embryos may carry other modification that may impact their potential of implantation as well, that we don't understand yet. How do I know it's chromosomally balanced? I think just looking at all the data we have, we track the implantation rate, we track the miscarriage rate, we track the delivery rate, and we run quality control, quality assurance on a regular basis. So we understand data, we are data driven. And I think that what makes a difference between a good lab and an okay lab, because you can't just test and send the results. You really have to understand what the implication of that testing in real life, in implantation and all that. Once we have, we know exactly what euploid rate in each age group based on a very large number of biopsy number. And so I think the quality assurance, quality control, and tracking outcome is what makes you feel comfortable about the data.
Okay, so you mentioned testing and how it's done, and how you actually did one of the first NGS cases. So on the new platform. So
Yes.
tell us, what does that mean? What is NGS? Like, how is the testing actually done? You use like a really, really strong microscope or a really strong magnifying glass? I'm just kidding. But how do you do it technically?
Yeah, so we receive a biopsy of a trophectoderm. So an embryo will grow till day 5, day 6. That embryo is a blastocyst. The trophectoderm is the outside layer that will eventually be transformed into placenta. That trophectoderm is biopsied, and we have about 5 or 6 cells in general. So we have very little material, and that material has to amplify. So we take it to the lab, we put some enzymes, and we try to replicate that DNA, replicate it till a point that we have enough DNA, and then we put some barcodes. So every biopsy has a barcode, and that barcode is associated with the patient, so that for tracking. And then we read the DNA. And when we read the DNA, then we identify what read we have obtained in what region of the chromosome, and we have to assemble that DNA and then evaluate chromosome copy. And that's what we report back to the fertility center.
And you mentioned good labs and okay labs. What are some okay labs? No, I'm just kidding. I don't expect you to. I'm teasing you. But why does the genetic testing lab matter? I know you brought that up a little bit and you talked about mosaicism, but is there anything else that a consumer or patient should know when it comes to picking a lab that would help them choose?
Yeah, I think a lab should have a geneticist. I think a lab should have scientists. beside the testing personnel are the clinical laboratory scientists that have been trained to do the test the same way every time, which is great. But testing alone is not enough. You have to have someone behind the scene looking at the data, trying to figure out that data makes sense, doing all the quality control, quality assurance necessary to assure that the data is accurate, tracking outcome. All that, you have to have some geneticists in that team. Not all laboratory have geneticists. Some of them have, technicians. And I think and you have to have someone who understand, genetics. I think it's not just using because the conception is that the lab has a bunch of technicians and the machines and they run the test. This is not a blood test that we will enter the data and spill out the results. This is really looking at the data, retesting if necessary, evaluating the data. It's like a pathology test. When you send a test on a slide and there is a pathologist who is looking at that tissue, trying to make a call there. Mm-hmm. And all the software will give you a call, but the softwares are not trained to identify certain things in a result. So that's where the experience come in.
So now, what are the testing limitations? Like, how accurate is it? What are the limitations that people should know about?
The testing limitation is that it does not detect very tiny changes. If the embryo has any mutation, it will not see them. If the embryo has really tiny deletions of, and when I say tiny, relatively speaking, that is, 5-6 million bases, that the test will not see it. So the test is designed to do a superficial scan on what embryo has potential, what embryo has all the chromosomes needed for a normal embryo development. Yeah.
So do you think if we were able to grow embryos out to like 15 days and then do a test, would we be able to pick up those really tiny abnormalities that could help patients pick out better embryos for transfer and give them a higher pregnancy rate?
There are other ways, less invasive, that we are currently working on. One of them is, instead of taking a biopsy and just testing it right away, we'll grow it. We'll grow that biopsy many days, and then you sample multiple times. Whenever you see a mosaic result, you can retest again. You have more supply material that has not gone through any modification, just pure cell division. And I think that could provide a great alternative as far as improving the test accuracy, and also looking for other things that you may be interested. If at the end you want to see genes that are mutations and more of a high resolution scan, you should be able to do that. I think that's the direction we're trying to explore.
You can grow the biopsy, the cells in the biopsy, or the DNA in the biopsy, not repeating the biopsy on the embryo.
No, so you let the biopsy grow further. And so what happens is the biopsy will those trophoblast cells will divide and divide. So instead of relying on 3 or 4 or 5 cells, now you have hundreds, maybe thousands of cells. And you can just take as much as you want, and you can take today and tomorrow and next day if you want. So if you have that unlimited supply, you're definitely going to get a good result. Also, what seems to be a mosaic result may be corrected over time, because sometimes you may just have a damaged tissue. Over time, if you have more cells coming from the same tissue, you're going to have a more normal looking cells, which will correct your call.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the hardest parts of my job is calling people to let them know that their pregnancy tests are negative, especially when they've gone through so much work, and that is the process of IVF for embryo creation, and then testing, and then a frozen embryo transfer, and all the stuff in between, like implantation testing and the ERA testing. So let's say you've done that. What are some explanations from your point of view as a scientist as to why a perfectly beautiful embryo that has normal chromosomes, and normal, you know what I mean by normal, euploid still doesn't attach.
Yeah. I think implantation, as far as we've seen, the highest implantation rate is probably high 70s, maybe around 80%. And you're talking probably 20 or 30% of non-implantation. I know you don't like failure of implantation. We're going to use non-implantation. Why, right? It could be anything. It could be, let's start with genetics. It could be genetics because embryos that have normal copy of chromosome are not necessarily competent to implants. They may not be expressing the right genes. They may have mutations. So we don't know anything about that aspect, right? It could be the endometrium, the endometrial tissue. It could be that it doesn't have the right environment for implantation. And you know all the story about endometrial receptivity and all that. It could be the transfer technique. There are so many variables. So that's about the IVF, is there are so many variables that it is sufficient for one variable to be off, then you don't have any implantation.
Yeah. And there's so many genes that are needed in order to be working in order for implantation to occur. And there are so many research articles written about the HLA genes and the KI or the KER genes. Why aren't we able to test those types of genes in embryos to help patients?
Yeah, if you remember, I've said earlier about extended growth. I think that could also enable us to look at gene expression right before implantation. But I think you're going to need to study also gene expression within the endometrial tissue to see if you have information on both sides, because embryo alone is not going to be able to implant if the environment is not favorable. So I think it's going to have to be studying the implantation milieu, which is the endometrium, and then studying the embryo ability to implant. And the studies, there are many studies, and I think it's wonderful to see some data. And I am sure labs are going to look at that aspect of assessing embryo and potentially assessing endometrium for implantation.
So what are some future developments that fertility patients can look forward to that can help them in the future from a genetic testing standpoint?
Well, one of them is non-invasive PGT-A testing. And that means that, we know that a biopsy is not the, ideal scenario for testing an embryo, because you have to cut a piece of the embryo. You have to, there's an additional level of stress put on the embryo prior to implantation. And so we and other labs are exploring non-invasive PGT-A testing. There are some challenges. One of them is maternal contamination, meaning that DNA that we see that looks like a normal female, but is just coming from the cumulative cells that are surrounding the oocytes before fertilization. We see some maternal contamination, and the consistency is not there. And Y chromosome is slightly weak in terms of detection. So we're working on all these details to optimize the test. But there are other companies that are also investing time and money in looking at non-invasive testing. I think that would be the next step. That's most labs are focusing on that. Then after that is going to be assessing an embryo from many other type of information, not just chromosome copy, but it's going to be a full scan of an embryo. And I think right now it's just the reason why we don't look at the entire embryo, because it costs more. On a financial aspect, it costs more to test an embryo on all these genes, and we don't know the implication well. But when these two things get optimized, the cost of testing and the information needed to understand the clinical implication, then I think that would be the next step.
Mm-hmm. And I know this sounds scary, you guys, at some point, each embryo will have like a picture of what your baby would look like as an adult. Don't you think?
Yeah, it's not something that we have not thought about. You can imagine a lot of genetic traits are inherited. You look at facial expression, you look at the distance between the eyes and all the features we see in our eyes, the body type, all those features are inherited. And yeah, science will be able to dissect that information, looking at moms and dad or partners, and then estimating that, or coming up with a possible scenarios in the child. The other things I can say is, now when you look at all these apps on Facebook and other applications, you can actually, by looking at pictures and combining those pictures, you can get a good guess of how the kids would look like physically. If you add the genetic components onto that, then you're going to refine it a little bit more. Whether that is going to be something the patient will go for is a different question. But scientifically, yes, it's possible.
I see a website, Embryomatch.com. Not just matched. Where did you meet? We met on Embryomatch.com. Okay. Anyways, okay. So almost done with this interview. This has been so great. And thank you for all the time that you've taken to, explain all this stuff for us. But I would love for you to just go through real quick, euploid rates by age. Can we do that?
Sure.
Okay. So let's just start 45 years old, blastocyst. What percentage rate of euploid?
45 is probably around 10%. I don't remember the number exactly, but I can give you a rough number. So 45 is probably around 10%.
Okay. 40 to 44?
I'll go 42. So 45, 43 to 45 within 10 to 15%. Okay. 40 to 42 around 20%. And then below 40, like 38, 40, we're talking about potentially 30%. Okay. At 37 to 40, we're talking about 50% to 60%, 50 to 55% in that range. And under 35, you're talking about 65%.
Okay.
And just relying on my memory, the numbers, but I may be off by 5% or so.
It sounds about right. Okay. Well, thank you again for all the things that you're doing to improve pregnancy rates for our patients, and all the research that you're doing to move the field forward so that my patients can shed less tears and hopefully do less cycles with me. So thank you again for coming on. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Amy.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer. Fertility expert Dr. Nabil Arrach,
And you have yet another success story.
just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.